The source folder contains all the JavaScript files we're going to write code in. In the end, the source folder is our main working directory. We're going to write our Vue application code in that source folder. The main JavaScript file here is the main entry point. And here you see we got an import syntax, which we haven't used thus far, but that is actually default JavaScript code, a modern JavaScript feature for importing functionality from one file into another file. And here we're importing the createApp function from the Vue framework. Before we used Vue.createApp, now we don't do that because now we don't have a globally available Vue object, but instead we can now import from the Vue framework and import things like the createApp method. And then we create an app with a configuration that seems to come from the app Vue file, more on that in a second, and we mount it to an element with an ID of app. And that's just this div here with the ID app in that index.html file. So that's how our Vue app ends up there. So it's a different way of calling createApp by using this import syntax, but we're going to use this import syntax throughout this course from now on, because this is the modern JavaScript way of exporting and importing features from one file to another. But what about this app.vue file? I mean, createApp always took this object with the data and so on. So why are we now passing app, which is coming from the app.vue file, to createApp? Well, let's see what's in app.vue. .vue files are a special Vue.js feature or a special Vue CLI project feature, I could say. .vue file allow us to write Vue apps and, to be precise, Vue components specifically, in a much nicer way. They allow us to split our template, so the HTML code that belongs to an app or a component, the script part, and also some styles into 3 different sections here. You see, we have a template tag here in this Vue file, which contains the template of this app, a script tag, which contains actually this config object we saw before, just with different keys, which we haven't seen before. But this indeed is where you also would add your data. But we'll have a look at that in greater detail in a second. And we have a style tag here, which allows us to define the styles, the CSS styles that should be available in this Vue app. And this is a file which would not work like this in the browser, but which Vue CLI will transform behind the scenes to code that will work, so that we as a developer have a nice way of defining our Vue apps with 3 sections like this, and we still will end up with code that just works in the browser. But how exactly does this work? And why might we want this? In the end, the project which we created with the Vue CLI uses a so-called build workflow. That's a fancy way of saying that the code we write is not the code that runs in the browser. Instead, our code has certain features, for example, next-gen JavaScript features, but also Vue-specific features and syntax like the .vue files, which wouldn't work like that in the browser. If you try to load a .vue file with the structure you just saw in the browser, it simply wouldn't do anything because the browser doesn't know what to do with that code. But that's the important thing now. The project generated with the Vue CLI has a lot of under-the-hood tools working on our code to transform that code in a so-called build step to code that works in the browser. So that build step is simply just a couple of transformations being applied to our code to change that code to standard JavaScript code with standard JavaScript features that do work in the browser. And then the development or real web server that hosts our app is able to show something on the screen because it only receives regular JavaScript code that just works. And in the end, our project also has such a setup under the hood In the end, the npm run serve script does not just spin up that development server, but also start this build process, which watches our code files and transforms the code. And that's why code like this here, with a separate template script and style tag, in the end is transformed to just JavaScript code, which runs in the browser. And this is a good thing, because you will see throughout the course that those .vue files, also called single file components, that those single file components are a pretty convenient way of writing Vue components and writing Vue code. On the other hand, at the moment, it doesn't look too appealing because, well, my IDE does not understand this .vue file at all. It's just a bunch of white text, no syntax highlighting, so at the moment, it's not really looking like a better way of writing code. Well, time to tweak the IDE, Visual Studio Code, a little bit as well.